السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ناصر المستضعفين، قاهر الجبابرة الطواغيت الظالمين، الذي جعل العاقبة للمتقين والعدوان على الظالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفقها في الدين يا رب العالمين. So as always, we'll go through, inshallah, a quick summary of last week's session. So last week we discussed the Islamic movements because we had been discussing a lot of the political, military events that had taken place. So we started off discussing the Islamic movements that came about. So we discussed the Muslim Brotherhood volunteering with the Egyptian army in 1948. Thereafter we discussed the quashing of the Islamic movements, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, etc., and the propaganda during the periods of Nasserism and Jamal Abdel Nasser, and in the years that followed. Thereafter, the start of the Islamic Center or Al-Mujamma al-Islami in Gaza in 1973, and thereafter the Islamic University of Gaza 1979. And we discussed some details with regards to the Islamic University of Gaza, and then eventually the Islamic resistance movement or Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya in 1987. Hamas in 1981 was also the establishment of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. So these were the Islamic movements that were established in Gaza that we discussed. Thereafter we discussed all the events that took place in the First Intifada, and we explained that it was called the Intifada or the Stone Intifada because basically all they had was stones. And it started off in December 1987 on the 8th when the crash happened with the a truck that was a tank transporter running into crashing the Palestinian cars, causing the death of 4 Palestinians, injuring others, led to the riots starting from the 9th, and thereafter it became a full-blown uprising against the Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. And it included civil disobedience, roadblocks, etc., strikes, boycotting, generally tax evasion, etc., not paying tax to the Israeli authorities, stone throwing, obviously, the Stone Intifada, the Israeli response by shooting, live rounds, beatings, etc., arrests, imprisonment. And the minister who was in charge of all of this, his name was Yitzhak Rabin or Ishaq Rabin, and he was the one who was known as the bone breaker because he gave the order basically to the forces to break the bones of the Palestinians, any of them who they are able to get hold of. And then we discussed the statements that came out. So on the 14th of December, the first statement that came out by the Islamic resistance movements in Gaza, and then their continuous statements that used to come out. Thereafter, the statements from the PLO, which started off from the 8th of January 1988, and how they were directing when and where the uprisings or the protests, etc., should be, when they should close their businesses, etc., things like this. And then we discussed in brief that 50,000 Palestinians were imprisoned, over 20,000 of them for 6 months or more without trial. The minimum age for detention was 12. Anyone under the age of 12 was the parents had to pay a fine, a hefty fine. It's just for throwing stones. If you don't harm anybody or anything, it was a prison sentence of 3 to 6 months. And then we discussed the sieges of the areas that they would do. They would besiege all the different areas, no food, no water, etc., no entry, no exit, deportation. 66 Palestinians were deported outside of their own country, and over 1,000 Palestinians were killed. The numbers vary during the 6 years, from 1987 to 1993. There are different numbers that are quoted here and there. We've said about approximately 1,100. Some say more than that. Some say up to 1,500. Estimates are. The exact number is a bit difficult to determine. 15,000 were injured, and over 100 Israelis were killed in various attacks. Thereafter, we discussed two profiles, two main figures who shaped what took place in the following years and for the following decades, up to, you could say, what the scenario is that we are in today. So the two individuals were Sheikh Ahmed Yassin from Gaza. He was born in 1936 in Al-Jura, next to Ashkelon. He was a refugee as part of the Nakba in 1948. His whole family had to move to Gaza. They moved by sea to Gaza, and he continued to live in the Ash-Shati refugee camp. And he was paralyzed at the age of approximately the age of 16, and so he did not really have any use of his arms and legs. We mentioned that his disability was not as severe until his first arrest in 1984, where after that, when he spent a year in prison, in the Israeli prisons, and once he came out, from 1985, he was wheelchair bound. And he suffered from other illnesses as well, like infections in his ears, in his eyes, etc., which caused him difficulties in hearing and seeing in the years that followed. And he was a teacher. He was an imam of the masjid in Al-Shati camp, and he was one of the main founders and of the Islamic movements inside Gaza and the revival of Islam in Gaza. He was one of the main figures who founded the Al-Mujamma al-Islami, the Islamic Center, in 1973. Thereafter, the Islamic University, 1979. He also had some involvement. Thereafter, the foundation of the Islamic Resistance Movement in December 1987 at the start of the Intifada. And then we discussed that he was arrested, first of all in 1984 for 1 year. Again, there was an exchange of prisoners. He was released. And then in 1989, on the 18th of May, he was arrested again, and then he was sentenced to life imprisonment. And then eventually he was released a number of years later, but we will discuss that when we come to it, inshallah. So this was brief, the history of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, as he was a pivotal figure. The other figure was Yasser Arafat. We've discussed him already in a number of different capacities. So he was born in 1929 in Cairo, and he was the president of the General Union for the Palestinian students. He studied civil engineering. He worked as a teacher in Kuwait. Thereafter, he established Fatah in 1959. Eventually, in 1969, he was chosen or elected as the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, and he resided in Egypt, thereafter Kuwait, thereafter in Jordan, where he was head of the Fidayeen and the Fatah armed resistance against the Israeli occupation, cross-border attacks, the Karama camp battle, thereafter the expulsion, Black September expulsion of PLO from Jordan, thereafter Syria, thereafter Lebanon, then the war in Lebanon 1982, then eventually he goes to Tunisia. So he's in Tunisia at this point in time of the First Intifada. So this is what we discussed in brief last week. So inshallah we'll continue from where we left off. So we discussed all of the events that were taking place in Palestine. So in Gaza, in the West Bank mainly. So these two areas in terms of the Intifada, etc. But in the political landscape, changes also started taking place. This is outside what's happening on the ground, so external. So we have on the 15th of November 1988, so almost a year, just a month shy of a year since the start of the Intifada, there's a conference that takes place. Now this is an annual conference that was taking place of the PLO, or what they had was the PNA, the Palestinian National Authority. And the whole point of the National Authority was basically like the legislative council of the PLO. So they make the rules and they make the decisions and legislate, and then that's then implemented. This is how the PLO. So the PLO has general membership, the PNA makes the decisions and is the legislative council. So they used to meet every single year. So this was the 19th meeting, and this meeting was determined to be in Algiers, and every year they would have it in different countries. In different Arab capitals. So they had it in Algeria, and in this meeting they made a declaration of the state of Palestine. So they declared the state of Palestine. So this was on the 15th of November 1988. And Yasser Arafat, as he was the head of the PLO, he was designated or appointed as the Palestinian president, as a Palestinian president. Now, obviously, on the ground, they didn't have any state or any kind of control or anything, but they decided to form a government in exile. So they made positions, etc. This person is in charge of economics. This is the economics minister. This is the transport minister. So all the ministers were all set up, but they were all mainly in Tunisia, where the PLO had their offices. And so this was in November 1988. Now the details of this declaration, which included a number of other statements alongside it, was the decision to recognize the state of Israel. Now this is the first time. So until this point, the PLO and all of its member organizations, be it Fatah, be it the Democratic Movement, be it the People's Liberation Front, all of the different organizations that they are, no organization had recognized the state of Israel or the right of the state of Israel to exist. The only country that had from the Arab world was Egypt, if you remember the Camp David Accords. But apart from Egypt, no other country had recognized the state of Israel. And all of these organizations, the PLO and its members, all of them denied the right of the existence of the state of Israel until this point. So this was a turning point, a major turning point. So they recognized the state of Israel by saying the pre-1967 borders. Obviously, in 1967 they took over the whole of Palestine in the 6-day war. They took over Gaza and the West Bank and everything. But pre-1967, so when the Gaza Strip and the West Bank was under the control of Egypt and Jordan, respectively. So this was, and this is according to the UN Resolution 242. So basically a two-state solution. So this is what this declaration of the state of Palestine entailed. Recognition of Israel, recognition of the UN Resolution 242, two-state solution, and Palestinian borders of pre-1967, the Gaza, the Strip, and West Bank. So what was the response? So first of all, it was recognized by Jordan. It was recognized by Jordan. Jordan were involved actively in this declaration. Jordan recognized the Palestinian state. They recognized Yasser Arafat as the president of the Palestinians, and they, if you remember, when in 1948 they claimed that the West Bank was part of Jordan, and they included it as part of Jordan. So after this declaration, they then put in a royal decree, and they removed the West Bank from being part of Jordan. So now West Bank officially becomes part of Palestine. Obviously, this is all on paper. But West Bank becomes part of Palestine and does not remain a part of Jordan anymore, and therefore the Palestinians who are living in the West Bank do not have the rights to Jordanian citizenship anymore. So the West Bank is on paper returned back to the Palestinians. By February 1989, so within a few months from November, 93 states internationally had recognized Palestine as a state, that there should be a state of Palestine. And PLO was a representative of the Palestinians. In fact, the US saw that this declaration by the Palestinians that came out of this conference was a recognition of the state of Israel and working towards peace. There was a statement or a speech made by Yasser Arafat a month later in Geneva, which reinforced all of these points, and therefore Yasser Arafat was seen as an individual who they could, or a partner that they could work with in terms of working towards peace between the Palestinians and the Israeli state. So the US was also recognized the PLO. At this point, the PLO was further later allowed to speak in the UN, etc., in future conferences. While this is going on, at the same time, the problems in the Gaza and the West Bank are ongoing. So in October 1990, we have a massacre in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, in the compound of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So what we have is, we have a group, they are ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they believe in the return of the Temple Mount, so the temple of Sulaiman alayhi salam, and the rebuilding of the third temple, and through that the Jewish dominance on earth and the return of their kingdom. And while this is a general belief amongst the different types of Jews, but the Temple Mount faithful, that's what they are known as, the group, they are based in Israel, and they are very right-wing, ultra-Orthodox in terms of their belief, that they need to forcefully build the temple. And so they tried to take a stone in 1988 towards the temple. There was some riot towards Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. There were some riots. In 1990, on the 8th of October, they declared that they will be taking a stone to lay the foundations for the Temple Mount. They will be taking a stone to raise. Now, what does this mean? In practice, this means to raise Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, the whole of the compound is Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, to raise all of it to the ground and build a temple in the place of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And so this would signify, this was a very significant event, to place the foundation stone. So they declared that they will take the foundation stone. The Israeli government said, we will not allow them, even though legally they are allowed to do so. The Palestinians, obviously, they heard the announcement that they will be coming on the 8th of October, and so the Palestinians gathered, messages were sent out, the Islamic resistance movements, they released statements saying that all the Muslims should gather in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa to prevent this foundation stone being laid. And they also planned to set up a hut that they do during their celebrations. Simple hut, but it's to represent the rule over this area and their celebrations. And they also intended or announced that they will set up this hut in the compound of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So the Palestinians, they gathered based on the statements made by the different organizations and the news that went around and the leaders of the community. They all gathered, many of the Palestinians, they gathered by Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and they stood there to defend Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa if any group was to come. However, what happened was that the police and the Israeli police, they came and they started to disperse the Palestinians who were standing there, and they started shooting, and they shot with live rounds. Palestinians then, so at that point in the area which is known as the Temple Mount of the Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa compound, there was construction going on, so there was loose stones, etc. there. So the Palestinians responded by throwing back stones to the Israeli police. And the Temple Mount is right by the Western Wall. The Western Wall, where you see when you go there, where the Jews go to worship, the Western Wall. So that's the location of where the Temple Mount area is of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa compound. And so they started throwing stones towards where the Israeli police were. And in this incident, 21 Palestinians were shot and killed by the Israeli forces, and many others injured. And this led to international condemnation. In fact, even there were UN resolutions, and there were harsh words from the US and even and other allies of Israel with regards to this incident and destroying the sanctity of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So this was on the 8th of October 1990. Thereafter, in 1990, we have the Gulf War. And Saddam Hussein, he invades Kuwait. So obviously previously there was, just before this, there was the Iraq-Iran war that took place. Thereafter you have the Saddam Hussein entering into Kuwait. So he invades Kuwait. And an alliance of the other Arab states, which include Saudi Arabia, the rest of the Gulf countries, etc., alongside the US. So US forces are now for the first time brought into the Arabian lands. They come into bases in all of these countries. And this alliance is formed to combat the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi forces. At this juncture, what happens is Yasser Arafat, he sides with Saddam Hussein. He sides with Saddam Hussein. Although he was the head of the PLO and on paper the president of the Palestinians. However, he didn't obviously have any land or an army, but he sided with Saddam Hussein politically. So openly his statement said he agreed and allied himself with the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam and his forces. This put him on the opposite side of the rest of the Gulf countries. And so as a result, a year later in 1991, at the end of the war, Kuwait expelled or forcefully expelled 200,000 to 300,000 Palestinians from Kuwait. Now if you remember, Yasser Arafat himself, when he moved from Egypt to Kuwait, and he was teaching in Kuwait. Initially, he set up Fatah while he was in Kuwait in 1959. So Kuwait, there were so many Palestinians there, so 200,000 to 300,000 Palestinians were expelled from Kuwait. Also, as a result of this, the Arab male nations, so Saudi Arabia and the other countries, etc., they stopped funding the PLO. So at this point in time, we're looking at 1991, their funding has been cut. So they have no relevance on the ground, and also their funding has been cut. And so they are teetering on the edge of non-existence. So the PLO is in serious crisis in 1990-1991. And this is when the peace process starts to emerge. So we have the PLO is brought in from the cold. They are strengthened during this period. So how the Israeli government saw it was that there is a need to combat the resistance or the Islamic resistance that is now taking place, because by this point in time the Intifada, etc., as we mentioned, was mainly being coordinated by the Islamic groups that were there, and so they were making the statements, they were telling and informing the Palestinians where and when to do the roadblocks, etc. And so and they were gaining supporters, they were gaining influence in the Palestinian society, and they were based on the ground inside the occupied territories. Not only that, this was a move from just a popular uprising to an Islamic or religious based uprising against the Israeli policies. And so there needed to be a counterbalance. And so the counterbalance was, let's bring in the PLO. And so the PLO was, as we said, recognized after the statement of the Palestinian state by the US, and this led to the Madrid Conference. So straight away after the funding is cut, etc., we find on the 30th of October to the 1st of November, so over a few days in 1991, there is a conference that takes place in Madrid. Now initially, so in this specific conference, there's no real outcome. There's no tangible outcome of the conference. Israel refuses to negotiate directly with the PLO. The PLO is open to negotiate with Israel, but Israel refuses to directly negotiate with the PLO. Instead, what they say is you can appoint some people to represent the Palestinians from within the occupied territories. And so a few Palestinians are chosen from Gaza and the West Bank to represent the Palestinians who are they are meant to be not directly related to the PLO, but the PLO are also involved in these discussions and these negotiations. So nothing really comes out of it except that they will discuss these matters again at another point in time, and there should be more meetings to discuss peace. However, Israel, the Israeli government said that there were a number of positives for the state of Israel that came out of these conference. The first was the cancellation of UN Resolution 3379. So the UN Resolution 3379 was that the resolution determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. So this was a resolution that was agreed upon by the UN by an overwhelming majority in 1975. So in 1975, the UN resolution was that Zionism has been determined to be a form of racism and racial discrimination. This was cancelled by a UN resolution following the Madrid Conference. So this was seen as a victory for the Israeli government. Also, it started negotiations and talks with other Arab governments who previously they had never had any direct negotiations or direct talks with. It also opened up some economic ties and relations with some of the Arab countries and Arab states. So this, for Israel, they saw it, but in reality there was nothing tangible that came out of the conference. During this period, the leaders of the countries changed. So in 1992, Yitzhak Rabin, he becomes the Prime Minister of Israel, replacing Yitzhak Shamir. And in January 1993, Bill Clinton replaces George Bush Sr. As the President of the United States. And from this, we have at the same time secret meetings taking place from December 1992. So the PLO send their economics minister, so the head of the economic department of the PLO, Abu Ala. And Abu Ala is sent to London initially, and he meets with the Israeli representative, who is Yair Hirschfeld, who is a lecturer at the University of Haifa. And they meet in London, and they have subsequent meetings to discuss the peace process and negotiations between the PLO and how they can move forward between the PLO and the Israeli government. So there's one representative of each. And they have initially they meet in London, thereafter they meet in a number of places. Eventually they end up meeting in Oslo a number of times. The place where they meet is the house of the foreign minister of Norway. The house of the foreign minister of Norway. And they have a number of discussions. And the crux of these discussions and these agreements are that there will be a Palestinian interim self-governance or self-administration of Gaza and the West Bank. There will be a withdrawal of the IDF and military forces from these two areas, and Gaza and West Bank will be declared as the Palestinian state eventually. But initially it will just be administration of these areas. So this is what the discussions are taking place between the representative of the PLO and the representative of the Israeli government. This then leads us on to the next events which lead towards Oslo and the First Oslo Accords or the First Oslo Treaty. The discussions that took place in Madrid was sponsored by both the US and the USSR. The discussions that took place previously. But obviously the USSR, within 1 month of these negotiations taking place in December, the USSR ceased to be and collapsed. So there was no USSR anymore. Now there was only one, seen to be only one world superpower, the US. And so as these discussions take place, the events are still taking place on the ground in Palestine. So in December 1992, Palestinians kill 8 IDF soldiers. 8 IDF soldiers. In response to the killing of 8 IDF soldiers, the Israeli forces, they arrest over 1,600 Palestinians. And 415 Islamic fundamentalists, as they were called, were expelled to no man's land in between Lebanon and Israel. So in the north of Israel, between the state of Israel and Lebanon. So if you remember, Israel has occupied Lebanon. Thereafter there's the Christian militia. We have the UN forces, we have the Christian militia, and then we have the other force, and we have the other forces in Lebanon. So Israel expelled 415 individuals, they said they were all Islamic fundamentalists, to this area where basically there were no facilities. The reason why it's no man's land is because there were no facilities. There's no villages, there's no residences, there's nobody is living there. They basically have basic, they cannot meet their basic needs. There's no infrastructure, nothing. They just have to eat and forage from whatever is there, and they were there for one whole year. Now, they call them Islamic fundamentalists, however 15 of them were Christian. So you can imagine the categorization that was made for these individuals. So some of them, yes, were part of the Islamic groups. However, as we said, 15 of them were Christian. So by January 1993, and the Intifada is coming almost to an end now. As we said, the Intifada was from 1987 to 1983. The Intifada is basically under complete control of the Islamic groups. So mainly Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so they are mainly fighting against the or resisting the Israeli occupation with stones and knives. There are a few attacks here and there. However, the number of weapons are few and far between. Initially, they had maybe just one weapon in 1992 or 1993, or two weapons where they were transporting the weapon from the West Bank to Gaza, then from Gaza to the West Bank, just to kill one soldier. Israel had set up weapons dealers. So an individual, he'll be selling weapons. He'll be a Palestinian. However, this Palestinian would actually be working for the Israeli intelligence services and be an informant. And so if any Palestinian was to go and purchase this weapon, the salesman would then inform the Israeli authorities that this certain individual came and purchased a weapon, and they would go and arrest him from his home, and either he would be arrested or killed or imprisoned. And so it was very difficult for the Palestinians in any of these groups to acquire weaponry. And so it was mainly stones and knives. They had one weapon in the West Bank. That weapon was used by a group, passed on to another group, which was then smuggled through Israel, through the checkpoints all the way to Gaza, for a group in Gaza to then carry out an attack on an Israeli checkpoint, then the weapon smuggled back. And so this was all they had. So mainly it was, as we said, stones and knives. On the other side, obviously Israel had a full-blown army, helicopter gunships, tanks, military vehicles, and all of the arsenal. So in July 1993, Israel launches an attack in the south of Lebanon. Israel launches an attack in the south of Lebanon against the Shia group Hezbollah. And as we said, this group was born out of the war in Lebanon in 1982. And it formally took formation after 1982, and over the years it started building itself up during this tentative peace that existed during the continuing occupation of southern Lebanon by the Israeli forces. So Israel starts bombing southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah, who is in these areas, over 300,000 individuals, Palestinians and Lebanese, become homeless due to this bombing and are forced out of their homes. It lasts for approximately, obviously Hezbollah responds, and there are cross-border attacks, and so this goes on for approximately 1 month until the 31st of July. On the 31st of July, both the Israeli government and Hezbollah, they sign a peace agreement, and the attacks come to an end. The operation was called Operation Accountability for a few cross-border attacks that had taken place. Although the attacks were on Israeli forces inside Lebanon, not inside the official state of Israel. Thereafter, we have on the 19th of August 1993. So all these events are happening very close to each other, one after the other. 19th August 1993, Shimon Peres, who's the foreign minister of the Israeli government, and the Ishaq Harabin, he travels to Oslo he travels to Oslo, where these secret meetings are taking place, to witness the declaration of principles. The declaration of principles, and we'll come to what the declarations of principles are. So the DOP, and this is what is being discussed now between the representative of the PLO and the Israeli government in these meetings in Oslo. And so eventually, high-level delegation, Shimon Peres, the foreign minister, is sent to this meeting to hammer out the details of what this declaration will be and what the agreement will be. And so the crux of this agreement, or the crux of the Declaration of Principles, the DOP, is that there will be an acknowledgement or a recognition of the right of Israel. So Yasser Arafat, his words are, the PLO recognizes the right of the state of Israel to exist, and to exist in peace and security. This is the recognition by Yasser Arafat and the PLO, and the promise that they make to Israel. And the recognition by Israel is that the government of Israel has decided to recognize the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people and to negotiate with it. Now, as you can see, there's a difference in the mutual recognition. The PLO is recognizing the Israeli state and the right for it to exist, and the right for it to exist with peace and security. The Israeli government is recognizing the PLO as an organization that represents the Palestinians and an organization with which it can negotiate. It is not recognizing a Palestinian state or the right of a Palestinian state to exist with peace and security. So these are the negotiations that are taking place, and this is the agreement that is being made. And so eventually this then leads on to the agreement that is signed, and the famous picture of Ishaq Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, shaking the hand of Yasser Arafat in front of Bill Clinton on the lawn of the White House as a culmination of the Oslo First peace process. So they sign the Declaration of Principles on the 13th of September 1993. And this is the famous image, I'm sure many of you will have seen, of the two prime ministers shaking hands. And this was the first meeting between, or public acknowledgement of the existence of the recognition of the state of Israel by a Palestinian, and also by the Palestinian leader meeting the leader of the Israeli government. Now, what were the terms of the DOP? So we'll quickly go through the terms of the DOP, inshallah. So the Declaration of Principles was that so there were a number of points. To summarize the points and the detail, so the point of the DOP was that there will be a number of principles, and these are the principles that the PLO and the Israeli government agree on as a framework to work towards eventual and everlasting peace. So this is the whole point of these principles. So it's supposed to be a framework to work towards peace, to solve the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. However, the text itself, not all of it was very clear. So it was open to interpretation. So the first point was that the Palestinians would be given a self-governing authority. So a self-governing authority or administration. So they would be able to administer affairs of the Palestinians in Gaza and Jericho, the West Bank. However, not all areas of the West Bank, part of the West Bank, not necessarily all areas of the West Bank. And this self-governance would be an interim self-governance, lasting for a period not exceeding 5 years. After, there would be a review and potentially move on to full authority after 5 years. But initially it was only for a 5-year period. Thereafter, discussion of permanent settlement talks. So the settlements that they had already established By this point, there are probably approximately 150,000 plus settlers in Gaza and the West Bank. So there are a large number of Jewish settlers inside both of these areas. And so there were a couple of UN resolutions, 242 and 338, with regards to the status of these settlers. And so part of the negotiations were to discuss whether all of these settlers would have to go back and leave the West Bank and Gaza, or whether some of the settlements in West Bank would be able to remain. Thereafter, final status negotiations. So they were called final status negotiations. So this was supposed to start within 3 years, so by December 1995. And the whole point of the final status negotiations was to discuss the issue of Jerusalem. Because the state of Israel wanted to claim Jerusalem as its capital, and the Palestinians also want to claim Al-Quds and Jerusalem as their capital. And so the whole point was that within 3 years they should sit down to agree upon the status of Jerusalem. Would it be a capital for the Palestinians, or would it be an internationally administered area, etc. So the whole issue of Jerusalem and Al-Quds would be discussed within 3 years. The second point would be the issue of Palestinian refugees. Now obviously we have millions of refugees by now in all of the different countries around the area of Palestine. So we have hundreds of thousands in Jordan, or actually over 1 million in Jordan. We have in Egypt, we have in Syria, in Lebanon, and even further afield in Iraq and Gulf countries. The Palestinians are everywhere, including Tunisia, Algeria. So the issue of Palestinian refugees and their right of return, the right to return to their home. And this was obviously a key point, because majority of the Palestinians had been removed from their homes during the Nakba in 1948, and thereafter during the Nasfa in 1967 and the 6-Day War. Thereafter, there was to be a discussion with regards to Israeli settlements. That what should be done with regards to Israeli settlements, should they all be removed, etc. So the decision is supposed to take place within 3 years. And also with regards to security and borders. So what are the exact borders to be agreed upon, and also the matters of security, how will they be managed between the Palestinians or the Palestinian state and authority and the Israeli government? Because obviously, according to this agreement, you have Gaza and you have West Bank, and if this is one country but is split by another country in the middle, there would be a gradual transfer of authority. So obviously by this point, since 1967, the Israeli government has been managing all of the areas of Palestine, and so the agreement was that there would be a gradual transfer of authority. So the education, health, social services, etc. would slowly be handed over to the Palestinian Authority. And it was at this point that the PA, or the Palestinian Authority, comes into being and is born. So the newly formed Palestinian Authority would have and would be allowed to have a police force. They would be allowed to have a police force. However, they would not be allowed to have an army. And this police force, main duty of the police force would be any normal crimes that take place. However, the main task and the agreement that was part of this declaration was that the police force would ensure that it would prevent any terrorism against Israel. And what that basically meant was any terrorism that takes place against Israelis, any kinds of resistance. So all of those groups that are not part of the Oslo process, any groups who have not recognized the Oslo process, any groups who still want to carry on the resistance against or armed resistance or violent resistance against Israeli forces and occupation that is still ongoing in Gaza and the West Bank, that they would be regarded as terrorists, not only by the Israeli government but by the Palestinian Authority, and the police of the Palestinian Authority would clamp down on these Palestinians to stop them harming the Israelis from within their area, so from within Gaza and the West Bank. And the external security issues, they would all be taken care of by Israel. So external security issues should be taken care of by Israel. Thereafter, Israel should withdraw from Gaza and Jericho, or the West Bank, by the 13th of December 1993. By the 13th of December 1993. Now, did they actually do that? We'll come to that soon. Thereafter, Israel would guarantee a safe passage between the two areas. So, as we said, obviously on the map, West Bank is on one side, Gaza is on the other side. There's nothing to join them, according to the pre-1967 borders. And so Israel will guarantee a safe passage for Palestinians between Gaza and the West Bank. So they should be able to travel between the two areas. However, the sea of the Gaza coast, so Gaza is on the coast, so the sea of the Gaza coast will stay within Israeli control. So Israel will still have control over the sea. The roads and the pathways and the routes that go from the West Bank to Gaza would stay under the control of Israel and would be controlled by Israeli security, and they would have the ability to do checkpoints to make sure that to maintain their own security as the Palestinians are crossing through their state and their land. The Israeli military and Israeli civilians, so Israeli military and Israeli civilians would have the right to freely use the roads and the routes in both Gaza and the West Bank. So the Israeli military and civilians. So even though it's a different state, the borders of which have not yet been agreed and defined, however, they have said in this Gaza and the West Bank, the Israeli military and civilians would still have free access to all of these areas. So they would be able to go through Gaza and go through the West Bank and all the areas of the West Bank as and when they want. Israel would also have the right to pursue any Palestinians who they want. So any wanted Palestinians, even if they were to be in Gaza or in the West Bank and under the PA administered areas, the Israeli forces would still have the full right to pursue these Palestinians in those places. And as we see today, the Israeli forces regularly go into different areas of the West Bank and raid the homes of Palestinians. So this is part of this agreement that took place and the part of the Declaration of Principles. Now, there was a goodwill gesture. So even though Israel has full control of the sea, of the coast of Gaza, they allow a small area where the fishermen are allowed to fish. And they also gave 8 coastal police boats to the Palestinian Authority to police the coast of Gaza. And they will also be allowed 4 fixed-wing transport vehicles that can go between Gaza and the West Bank. So the West Bank has an airport. Gaza also had an airport. It was destroyed, but there was an airport in Gaza and an airport in the West Bank, and they were allowed 4 fixed-wing planes that would travel between Gaza and the West Bank in order to transport goods. So civilian aircraft for the sake of business, but they would be subject to Israeli air traffic control, obviously. And they also agreed that they would release 5,000 Palestinian prisoners that they had in the Israeli jails, many of them from Fatah and the PLO, as the PLO had now denounced terrorism. Now, obviously, this agreement was flexible in terms of interpretation of a number of points, but there were a number of points which were actually quite fixed. So, for example, we have the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and the West Bank by 13th of December 1993. So by 13th of December 1993, they have to withdraw completely from these two areas. Now, the withdrawal, did it actually take place? The reality is that until 13th of May 1995, so 1.5 years later, they had only evacuated 2 towns in the West Bank. They had only withdrawn from 2 towns in the West Bank. And Jericho, and we've discussed Jericho, 150 kilometers or square kilometers of Jericho was supposed to be handed over to the Palestinian Authority. However, by this time, they had only handed over 15 square kilometers. And this is in accordance with those terms which were specifically dated and mentioned within the agreement. And eventually, over the years, they gave the Palestinians 65 square kilometers from the 150, which they were supposed to give in the agreement. In terms of Gaza, the military forces, so the IDF, did not withdraw from Gaza until 1994. So they did not withdraw their forces from Gaza until 19th of May 1994. But they still remained in the settlements still remained in Gaza, and Israeli de facto control still remained in these areas. So this was the Declaration of Principles that was agreed as part of the Oslo process in 1993. And this is where we will stop today, inshallah ta'ala, and what were the repercussions or the implications of the Oslo peace process. How did it impact on the lives of the Palestinians and the realities of the ground we'll cover in more, and what took place in the years following we'll cover in more details next week, inshallah ta'ala. If there are any questions before we finish?
There seems to be like loads of attempts to make peace that obviously never seem to work. Why would Israel continue to like try and why are these attempts even made if they don't want to do it? Are they just trying to pacify everybody, or are they actually trying to make peace?
Okay, so the question is, why are they making these peace agreements? So at this point in time, when the Oslo Accords or the DOP was signed, Israel was under a lot of pressure. There was an intifada, an uprising that was taking place inside Palestine, now for 6 years, starting from December 1987 all the way until 1993. Also at the same time, there were attacks on Israeli forces from the groups in Lebanon, Hezbollah, etc. And there was support was gathering for the local forces or resistance forces, the Islamic movements inside Palestine. So until then, all of the resistance had been external. The PLO and their forces had always been in other countries. They had been crossing border from Jordan into Israel, then Lebanon into Israel, initially in the first few days from Egypt into Israel. But there was nothing much taking place within its own borders. They had arrested a lot of people here and there, but they weren't facing such a mass uprising. This was the first time that there was such a mass uprising against Israeli control. And not only that, the more they tried to crack down, the more Palestinians became involved. So the more bones they break, the more bones there are to break, because there are more Palestinians getting involved in the Intifada. And so they were under pressure. Also, as we mentioned, the Islamic resistance movements were gaining traction. And if the PLO initially was a terrorist organization, we don't want to discuss with them, we don't want to speak to them, we don't want to have any kind of negotiations with them, we don't recognize them. That's why they recognize them eventually as a partner to negotiate with. So they needed to play off the two sections, you could say, or the two different parties that were there as a resistance to the Israeli rule. So they bring in these negotiations, deals are signed, but you don't have to agree to those deals. Make sure you keep the wordings very vague, or vague to an extent that they are open to interpretation. And even if it's not open to interpretation and you go against the agreement, it doesn't really matter because you stay in control. They needed an end to the Intifada in any case. In 1993, there needed to be an end. And this peace process brought about an end to the Intifada. And so it stopped the uprisings that took place. But the reality of situation on the ground never changed. And also it helped the Israeli government in that they did not now need to chase every single member of all of these organizations and resistance movements that are there, because now they have a Palestinian Authority with a police force who is cracking down on the Palestinian terrorists for them. And so it cuts their work out. In fact, there was at one point where in 1996, for example, 40% of the arrests of Palestinians that were made by the Palestinian Authority, not by the Israeli government. So that maybe answers the question. So there are different points where peace treaties are made either because of the military situation or the security situation, etc., which then means that they have to take some kind of steps to make sure that they can continue and safeguard themselves for a longer period of time.
This doesn't look like the PLO are actually representative of the Palestinians who are actually living there at this moment in time. They might be representing the others that are actually out of town. Those who are living there.
So the PLO, in terms of representation, we discussed I think slightly before as well. So the PLO was set up and officially recognized by the Arab League. So they were designated by the Arab League. They weren't necessarily chosen by all of the Palestinians. Obviously at this point, the PLO didn't really have much relevance on the ground until this point. And so just before 1993, the PLO is not that relevant. Yeah, they've made these political statements and then sided with Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and so they've lost even Arab support. So in reality, they weren't fully representative of the people on the ground. However, they were the ones who were active. So they were active. Obviously, at this point we have many other groups, and so while Fatah, for example, is the main part of the PLO, and they have recognized the peace process, you have a number of other organizations who leave the PLO. So the organizations which you mentioned initially at the beginning, the DFLP, the PFLP, if you remember, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, at one point they left the PLO. They formed, so as a result, we'll cover next week inshallah, but there were alternative groups formed to oppose the PLO as a response to what took place as part of the Oslo peace process. So no, they weren't representative of all of the Palestinian people. However, we need to understand how the Palestinian people would conceive what is taking place, because since 1948 they've been under occupation, since 1967 total occupation. Now there is some kind of recognition and some kind of rights for the Palestinians and some kind of self-rule and some kind of self-governance. It's like they were initially in a cage, but now they're put on a short rope, so they're allowed to have a bit of freedom and to roam around and eat some of the grass, whereas before they were just being fed hay by the owner. So it was a better situation than what they were in. But in terms of the total impacts, inshallah, we'll discuss more detail next week, inshallah. So why did Yasser Arafat ally with Saddam Hussein? What we had there was generally the other states, they weren't really, let's say, that supportive of the Palestinian resistance at that point in time. Yes, there were funding, etc., but Saddam Hussein was supportive of the Palestinians. In this war, he sent rockets and he bombed Israel. Okay, so Saddam Hussein he invades Kuwait, all of the Gulf countries, they get together to fight against Saddam Hussein, but they say we can't do it ourselves. Oh, America, please come and save us. So America says, okay, let me put bases inside Saudi Arabia, let me put bases inside Bahrain, let me put bases inside Kuwait, inside Qatar, in all of these countries. They all agree. The US forces go on the ground, they assist them. Saddam Hussein, to get the support of the people on his side, he bombs Israel with a number of missiles, and a number of Israelis are killed. The US government specifically orders Israel not to respond. So Israel has no response to the bombing of Israel by Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Obviously, for the Palestinians, this is the first time any country has bombed Israel, and so they're going to say this man supports us, and on the other side we have the US with all the rest of the countries, and therefore they are against our movement. So it was almost, you could say, a natural inclination for him to support or ally with, not ally because they didn't physically take part in anything, but to support the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. Any other questions? No? Okay, khair inshallah. May Allah Azza wa Jal enable us to have an understanding of these issues and these events that took place, so that we can gain an understanding of how we should react and how we should understand the situations that we go through in our lives, and the situations and the events that are currently taking place. May Allah Azza wa Jal enable us to make correct decisions. May Allah Azza wa Jal enable the leaders of the Muslims to make those decisions that are correct to bring the benefit of Islam and the Muslims and the whole Ummah. May Allah Azza wa Jal alleviate the sufferings of our brothers and sisters in Palestine, specifically in Gaza and the areas of the West Bank where they are being targeted on a daily basis. It's now the 119th day of the current escalation. May Allah Azza wa Jal bring back to our brothers and sisters peace and security and prosperity and freedom, and may Allah Azza wa Jal free al-Masjid al-Aqsa, and may Allah Azza wa Jal grant us all salah in al-Masjid al-Aqsa, which is free and under the rule of the Muslims with peace and security. آمين وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين جزاكم الله خيرا سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.